Dr. Sarah Bennett had examined thousands of photographs during her career as a historical researcher at the Savannah Heritage Museum, but something about this particular wedding portrait made her pause. The image showed a young couple standing rigidly before an ornate backdrop, typical of early 1900s studio photography. The groom stood tall and severe, his jaw set firm, while the bride beside him wore an elaborate white gown with layers of lace and silk. It was a donation from a local estate sale, part of a collection of family memorabilia dating back generations. Sarah had been cataloging the items for weeks, but this photograph demanded closer attention. There was something in the bride's expression, not the demure happiness expected of a newlywed, but something else entirely. Her eyes held a distant, almost defiant quality that seemed unusual for the era. Sarah adjusted her magnifying glass and leaned closer to the century-old image. The bride's left hand rested at her side, partially obscured by the cascading fabric of her wedding dress. As Sarah increased the magnification, her breath caught. There, barely visible beneath the folds of white silk, was the unmistakable shape of a blade, a dagger with an ornate handle, gripped tightly in the young woman's concealed hand. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered to herself. Wedding photographs from 1904 were carefully staged formal affairs. Every detail was planned and scrutinized. Yet, here was undeniable evidence of something deeply wrong, a bride armed at her own wedding. Sarah immediately photographed the detail with her high-resolution camera and began searching through the accompanying documents. A faded marriage certificate identified the couple, Elizabeth Rose and Thomas Whitmore, married June 14, 1904, Savannah, Georgia. The investigation had begun. Sarah knew that behind this photograph lay a story that had been hidden for over a century, and she was determined to uncover the truth. Sarah spent the next morning in the museum's archive room, surrounded by leather-bound registry books and yellowing documents. The marriage certificate provided her first leads. Elizabeth Rose, age 19, daughter of William and Martha Rose. Thomas Whitmore, age 34, merchant and landowner. The 15-year age gap immediately raised questions. She cross-referenced the names with census records, property deeds, and newspaper archives. Thomas Whitmore's name appeared frequently. In the Savannah Morning News business section, he owned several warehouses along the riverfront and was described as a prominent businessman of considerable wealth and influence. His father had been a cotton broker before the Civil War, and the family had maintained their social standing despite the upheaval. Elizabeth Rose's family, by contrast, left barely a trace. Her father had been a clerk who died in 1902, leaving his widow and daughter in difficult financial circumstances. Sarah found a brief obituary that mentioned survived by his devoted wife Martha and beloved daughter Elizabeth. As she dug deeper, Sarah discovered something troubling. In the months leading up to the wedding, the Savannah Morning News Society pages mentioned Thomas Whitmore's anticipated nuptials multiple times, but always with peculiar phrasing. The fortunate Miss Rose, a beneficial union for all parties, a marriage of great advantage. The language suggested arrangement rather than romance. Then Sarah found a city directory from 1903 that listed Martha Rose and her daughter Elizabeth residing at a boarding house on the edge of town, one known for housing widows and working women in reduced circumstances. The picture was becoming clearer. A young woman from a struggling family, a wealthy older suitor, and a marriage that likely offered financial salvation. But that didn't explain the dagger. Sarah pulled the photograph closer again, studying every detail of Elizabeth's face. Behind the formal composure required by the camera's long exposure, she could now see what she'd missed before. A subtle tension in the jaw, a tightness around the eyes. This was not nervousness. This was fear. Sarah's next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching property records related to the Whitmore family, she discovered that Thomas Whitmore's first wife, Catherine, had died in 1901, just 3 years before his marriage to Elizabeth. The death certificate listed the cause as accidental fall downstairs. A single accidental death might not raise suspicion, but Sarah's historian instincts were alert. She searched for newspaper coverage of Catherine Whitmore's death and found a brief article buried on page 6. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, wife of merchant Thomas Whitmore, suffered fatal injuries yesterday evening at the family residence on Bull Street. The unfortunate lady fell down the main staircase and was discovered by household staff. She was 28 years old. The article was remarkably sparse for a death in a prominent family. No mention of a funeral, no quoted statements from the grieving widower, no details about the circumstances. Sarah noted that the incident occurred on a Wednesday evening when household staff would typically be finishing their duties and preparing to leave. She expanded her search and found Catherine Whitmore's obituary. It mentioned her maiden name, Catherine Brennan, and that she was preceded in death by her infant son, Thomas Whitmore Jr., who passed in 1900. A child's death followed by the mother's death within a year. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized a pattern she'd seen too often in historical records. The quiet tragedies of women whose suffering was hidden behind closed doors. Determined to find more about Catherine, Sarah contacted the historic Savannah Foundation and requested access to their collection of personal letters and diaries from prominent families. 2 days later, she sat in their reading room with a box of correspondence from the Brennan family, Catherine's relatives. Among the letters, she found one dated March 1901, 4 months before Catherine's death, written by Catherine to her sister Margaret in Charleston. The handwriting was shaky, the tone desperate. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she carefully unfolded Catherine Brennan Whitmore's letter. The paper was brittle with age, but the words remained clear, written in a hurried, uneven script that betrayed the writer's emotional state. Dearest Margaret, I write to you in secret, as Thomas monitors all my correspondence. Sister, I fear I have made a terrible mistake in marrying him. What appeared to be kindness during our courtship has revealed itself as something far darker. He controls every aspect of my life, whom I speak to, where I go, what I wear. Last week, when I asked permission to visit Mother, he struck me across the face and told me that my only family now is him. Sarah paused, her throat tight. She had studied enough historical documents to know that domestic violence was rarely documented so explicitly. Women of that era had few options and little recourse. The letter continued. The servants avert their eyes when they see the bruises. Mrs. Patterson, our housekeeper, tried once to ask if I needed help, and Thomas dismissed her the next day without reference. Now no one dares acknowledge what they witness. I am trapped in this house, this marriage, with no escape. Father would be horrified if he knew, but I cannot tell him. The shame would destroy our family's reputation, and Thomas has threatened to ruin Father's business connections if I speak against him. The letter ended abruptly. I must close now. I hear his footsteps on the stairs. Pray for me, sister. Your loving Catherine. Sarah sat back, processing what she'd read. Catherine died 4 months after writing this letter, falling down those very stairs she'd heard her husband ascending. The death was ruled accidental, but Sarah no longer believed in that coincidence. She photographed the letter and continued through the box. She found 2 more letters from Catherine, both expressing similar fear and desperation. Then she found Margaret's response, dated 2 weeks before Catherine's death. I am coming to Savannah. You must leave him. I will help you, whatever the cost. But Margaret never saved her sister. Catherine died before she could arrive. With Catherine's tragic story illuminated, Sarah turned her focus back to Elizabeth Rose, the 19-year-old bride who had concealed a dagger in her wedding dress. What had Elizabeth known about Thomas Whitmore before she married him? Sarah returned to the city directories and census records, tracing Elizabeth's life before the wedding. She found that Elizabeth had attended Miss Porter's School for Young Ladies until 1902, when her father's death forced her to withdraw. After that, the records showed Elizabeth working as a shop girl at Levy's department store on Broughton Street. A breakthrough came when Sarah discovered employment records from Levy's in the museum's business archive. Elizabeth Rose was listed as a clerk in the fabric department from October 1902 until May 1904, 1 month before her wedding. Her employment ended with a notation, resigned to marry. But it was a note attached to her employee file that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Reliable worker, excellent with customers, witnessed an altercation between Mr. Thomas Whitmore and his ward, Miss Julia, on premises February 1904. Employee handled situation with discretion. Thomas Whitmore had a ward? Sarah immediately began searching for information about Julia. She found her in the 1900 census. Julia Preston, age 12, niece of Catherine Brennan Whitmore, living in the Whitmore household after her parents died of yellow fever. After Catherine's death in 1901, Julia would have remained in Thomas's custody, a young girl, orphaned twice over, living with a man who had likely murdered her aunt. Sarah's stomach turned. She needed to know what happened to Julia. Death records showed no entry. Marriage records showed nothing. Then, in a Savannah Morning News article from March 1904, she found a small notice. Miss Julia Preston, age 16, has enrolled at the Sacred Heart Academy boarding school in Charleston, sponsored by the charitable contribution of her guardian, Mr. Thomas Whitmore. He had sent her away. 3 months later, he married Elizabeth. Sarah wondered if the altercation Elizabeth had witnessed at Levy's was Thomas threatening or abusing Julia, and if that's when Elizabeth first understood the danger she was entering. Sarah needed to understand how Elizabeth went from witnessing Thomas Whitmore's true nature to agreeing to marry him. She returned to the newspaper archives, searching for any mention of the engagement announcement. She found it in the society pages from April 1904. Mr. Thomas Whitmore, esteemed merchant of this city, announces his engagement to Miss Elizabeth Rose, daughter of the late William Rose. The wedding will take place in June at Mr. Whitmore's residence. Miss Rose's mother, Mrs. Martha Rose, expresses great joy at the advantageous match. The phrasing struck Sarah. Great joy at the advantageous match. Not love, not happiness, but advantage. Sarah cross-referenced this with financial records and discovered that in March 1904, just 1 month before the engagement, Martha Rose had been served with an eviction notice from her boarding house for unpaid rent. Then, in May 1904, that same debt was mysteriously cleared, and Martha Rose moved to a small cottage on the outskirts of Savannah, a cottage that property records showed was owned by Thomas Whitmore, The picture was now devastatingly clear. Thomas had identified a desperate family, a widowed mother and her daughter facing poverty and social ruin, and offered a solution. Marriage to Elizabeth in exchange for financial security for her mother. It was a transaction, carefully orchestrated by a man who had already driven one wife to her death. But Elizabeth had witnessed something at Levy's that February. She had seen Thomas's capacity for cruelty firsthand. She knew what she was agreeing to, yet she had no choice. Her mother's survival depended on it. Sarah found one more crucial document. A receipt from Morrison's Hardware on Bay Street, dated May 28, 1904, 2 weeks before the wedding. The purchase. One decorative letter opener with silver handle engraved. The buyer, Elizabeth Rose. It wasn't a letter opener. Elizabeth had purchased the dagger herself, knowing exactly what kind of man she was about to marry. She had armed herself for her wedding day because she understood that her life was in danger. Sarah contacted the Savannah Historical Society, hoping to find more information about the actual wedding. A librarian named James led her to a collection of personal journals donated by various Savannah families. Among them was a diary belonging to Clara Sutherland, a woman who had been friends with Martha Rose. Clara's entry from June 14, 1904, provided a first-hand account of the wedding day. Attended Elizabeth Rose's wedding this afternoon at the Whitmore residence on Bull Street. It was a small affair, quite unusual for a man of Thomas Whitmore's standing. Only immediate family and a handful of witnesses present. Martha looked relieved but anxious. Elizabeth appeared calm, almost unnaturally so, as if she had steeled herself for an ordeal rather than celebrating a joyous occasion. Clara continued, "During the ceremony, I noticed Elizabeth kept her left hand hidden in the folds of her dress. When the Reverend asked if she took Thomas as her husband, there was the briefest hesitation, a moment where I thought she might refuse. But she whispered, 'I do,' and the deed was done." Thomas smiled in a way that made me uncomfortable. There was possession in that smile, not love. The entry concluded, "The photographer took their portrait in the parlor afterward. Elizabeth stood rigid as a statue. I tried to catch her eye, to offer some gesture of support, but she seemed to be somewhere far away, her gaze fixed on something beyond the camera. I pray she will find happiness, but I fear for her future." Clara's observations confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Elizabeth walked into that marriage knowing exactly what awaited her, armed with the only defense she could manage, a hidden blade and an iron will. Sarah needed to know what happened after the wedding. She searched for any subsequent records of Elizabeth Whitmore. Birth certificates, death records, property transfers, anything that would tell her if Elizabeth survived her marriage or became another of Thomas Whitmore's victims. The search proved difficult. Women's identities were often subsumed by their husbands' names, their individual lives erased from public record. Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, police records. The Savannah Police Department had recently digitized their historical incident reports, and Sarah spent hours scrolling through entries from June 1904. On June 15, 1904, the day after the wedding, she found a report that made her heart race. Incident report, disturbance at 412 Bull Street, residence of Thomas Whitmore. Response to noise complaint from neighbors. Upon arrival, officers found Joe Whitmore with severe lacerations to his right arm and hand. He claimed injury was accidental, result of broken window. Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore present, unharmed but visibly shaken. Mr. Whitmore declined medical assistance and refused to file report. Officers noted broken glass in bedroom, signs of struggle. Mr. Whitmore insisted officers leave premises. No further action taken due to complainant's refusal to cooperate. Sarah read the report 3 times, her mind racing. The broken window, the lacerations on Thomas's arm and hand. Elizabeth visibly shaken but unharmed. This was no accident. Elizabeth had used the dagger. She searched for subsequent reports and found another entry dated June 18, 1904. Follow-up. Visit to Whitmore residence requested by concerned neighbor Mrs. Adelaide Hampton. Mrs. Hampton reported hearing screams and sounds of violence night of June 15th. Officers visited premises, spoke with Mr. Whitmore, who stated all was well and denied any domestic disturbance. Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore declined to speak with officers. Mr. Whitmore warned against further interference in private family matters. Then silence. No more police reports. No hospital records. For 3 months, Elizabeth disappeared from the public record entirely. Sarah's concern deepened. Had Thomas killed Elizabeth and covered it up? Had she become another accidental death like Catherine? But then, in September 1904, Sarah found something that changed everything. A passenger manifest for the steamship Savannah Queen, departing Savannah for New York City on September 23, 1904. Among the passengers listed, Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore, traveling alone. Elizabeth had left. Somehow, she had escaped. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued searching. What she found next would reveal the full, extraordinary truth. Sarah tracked Elizabeth's trail to New York City, where census records showed her living under her maiden name, Elizabeth Rose, in a boarding house in Greenwich Village. She was listed as a seamstress, working at a garment factory, but the most significant discovery came from the New York City court records. In October 1904, just 1 month after arriving in New York, Elizabeth Rose filed a legal affidavit as part of a criminal investigation. Sarah requested the full court documents, and when they arrived, she finally understood the complete story. Elizabeth's sworn testimony, given before a New York City magistrate, detailed everything: Thomas Whitmore's abuse of his first wife, Catherine, his mistreatment of his ward, Julia, and most importantly, what had happened on the wedding night. According to Elizabeth's statement, on the night of June 14th, 1904, after the guest departed, my husband revealed his true nature. He told me I now belonged to him completely and that he would teach me obedience, as he had taught his first wife. When he advanced toward me with violent intent, I defended myself with a blade I had concealed in my wedding dress. I wounded him in the arm and told him that if he ever touched me, I would kill him. The testimony continued. For 3 months, we lived in a state of armed standoff. He knew I was prepared to defend myself, and I knew he was waiting for an opportunity to overpower me. I contacted Mrs. Adelaide Hampton, our neighbor, who had been friends with Catherine. She helped me communicate with Catherine's sister Margaret in Charleston. Margaret sent money and helped arrange my escape. But the most crucial part of Elizabeth's testimony concerned Julia Preston. Before leaving Savannah, I contacted Julia at her boarding school in Charleston. She revealed that my husband had been physically abusive to her as well, which is why she welcomed being sent away to school. Julia provided written testimony corroborating the abuse she witnessed him inflict upon his first wife, Catherine. We both believe Catherine's death was no accident. Sarah sat back, stunned. Elizabeth hadn't just escaped, she had fought back. She had gathered evidence, connected with other victims, and built a case against Thomas Whitmore. Sarah's final discovery completed the story in a way she never expected. The court documents showed that Elizabeth's testimony, combined with Julia's affidavit and Margaret's letters from Catherine, triggered a grand jury investigation in Savannah. In December 1904, Thomas Whitmore was indicted on charges of assault and suspicion of murder in Catherine's death. While the murder charge couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt, too much time had passed, and evidence had been lost. The assault charges were substantiated by the police reports from June, Elizabeth's testimony, and statements from former household servants who, once Thomas's power was broken, came forward with their own accounts of his violence. Thomas Whitmore was convicted of assault in February 1905 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His social standing evaporated, his business collapsed, and his property was sold to settle debts. He died in prison in 1908, according to a brief obituary that mentioned no mourners. Elizabeth never returned to Savannah. She remained in New York, where she became an advocate for women escaping abusive marriages. Sarah found her name in the records of the Women's Relief Society and the Working Women's Protective Union. Elizabeth trained as a legal secretary and spent 30 years helping other women navigate divorce, proceedings, and restraining orders, legal tools that barely existed in her time, but that she fought to strengthen. Elizabeth died in 1954 at age 69, never remarrying. Her obituary in the New York Times described her as a pioneer advocate for women's legal rights and protections against domestic violence. Julia Preston, freed from Thomas's guardianship, became a teacher and eventually founded a school for orphaned girls in Charleston. Sarah stood in the museum's exhibition hall, carefully placing the wedding photograph in a new display case. Beside it, she arranged Elizabeth's testimony, the police reports, and a photograph of Elizabeth taken in 1920, standing confidently outside the Women's Relief Society office in New York. The exhibit's title read, "Armed with Courage, Elizabeth Rose and the Hidden Blade, 1904. As visitors gathered around the display, Sarah watched their faces transform, shock, recognition, and finally respect. The photograph that had seemed so ordinary revealed itself as a testament to one woman's refusal to become a victim, her determination to survive, and her commitment to ensuring other women could escape the fate she had narrowly avoided. The dagger hidden in Elizabeth's wedding dress wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of resistance, survival, and the fierce courage required to fight back when society offered no protection. Elizabeth's story had been hidden for 120 years, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the truth. Now, finally, her bravery would be remembered, her legacy honored, and her message clear. Even in the darkest circumstances, when armed with nothing but courage and determination, survival is possible, and justice, however delayed, can still prevail.